Okay, hold on. Do you not have while? There we go. Okay. Here we go. 1, 2. While I draw this fleeting breath, when my eyes shall close in death, when I soar to worlds unknown, see thee on thy judgment throne, rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. All right, so I'm just going to look at that from now on because it's different. All right, one more song that's going to be I Stand Amazed in the Presence. And let me just get the music up here. "143. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unclean. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. For me it was in the garden, he prayed not my will but thine. He had no tears for his own griefs, but sweat drops of blood for mine. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. He took my... Okay, John. Okay, there we go. Hey, John, pay attention. Okay, verse 3. What do I give this? 1, 2, 3. He took my sins and my sorrows. He made them his very own. He bore the burden to Calvary and suffered and died alone. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. When with the ransomed in glory his face I at last shall see, 'twill be my joy through the ages to sing of his love for me. How marvelous, how wonderful, and my song shall ever be. How marvelous, how wonderful is my Savior's love for me. All right, good singing. Thank you, Kelly. And give John some credit. I know it's hard back there. Yeah.
Good evening. I will move this out of the way. How are you doing today? And I promise today I won't preach more than I just discovered there's a clock there. So that'll help.
Do you need a bigger one?
Huh?
Do you need a bigger
I would need a bigger one, a small one right there. You know? I need to look at, hey, you know, Paul didn't think that he preached too long until one day one guy fell asleep and fell down and died. You know, hopefully none of you dies because I preached too long, but promise it's going to improve. Let's open our Bibles in Ruth. and let's continue with this amazing story. You have a handout there that's for you to follow the outline and take notes and write some things that you might think are interesting, some things that maybe you didn't know before. Ruth is in the Old Testament. It's somewhere between Genesis and Malachi. We're going to be thinking about chapter 2 tonight. How many of you have read the whole book before? Ruth. Okay. Most of you. And how many of you saw things that we were talking about, like the life of Naomi this morning and things like that? Sometimes we read a book so many times and we miss some things because we know this story too well. So we come to the Bible with that story in mind, and that's all we see. But as I've told you, the book of Ruth is about God coming to his people in their aid to provide for their needs and all of that. This morning we talk a little bit about the essence of God's provision. Remember, as we read and as we thought and meditated through chapter 1, we saw Elimelech making poor choices, being outside of God's will, trying to provide for his needs on his own strength, trying to fix the problem on his own, and they end up in a situation where they are completely destitute. In this case, Naomi, because really Elimelech and the two sons are there just to give structure to the story. But it really is about Naomi, and Naomi is completely destitute until she hears that God, Yahweh, the Lord, had visited Israel. And we talked about that. Real provision is found when you choose the great provider. We saw the example of Naomi. She heard about God and she decided that she was going to go back to Bethlehem, the house of bread, the house of provision. And the two daughters-in-law, they had the chance too to make their own choice. Orpah decided to go back to her land. And Ruth, she chose the great provider. Your God will be my God, and your people, my people. And there they go. And that's where the chapter 2 picks up. All we've said so far is that real provision comes from choosing the great provider. Yet, we have not seen the provision yet. How is God going to provide for Naomi and Ruth and eventually for the whole nation of Israel and then for the whole humanity? And you might think, what does the whole earth have to do with a family sometime so many years ago? Well, we'll find out next Sunday. Like the Mexican soap operas, you cannot miss it. I'm just giving you trailers. I'm giving you the trailer, some clips of the story to come, so you can be excited and looking forward for that. But remember, chapter 1:22 finishes with these verses. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, and her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. That's very important because they arrive in Bethlehem at the best moment, when the abundance of food it's about to be collected. This is the best time. They didn't arrive in winter. They arrived when they were harvesting the grain. and God is going to provide for them. So chapter 2 is about God's provision. We've said in chapter 1, it's setting the whole story. But in chapter 2, we are going to see how God provides for His children. And what does He do and how does He do it? That's why the title of today is Provision Under the Wings of God. And I quoted that as a subtitle from a verse of the New Testament. Let us love not just in word, but also in deed and in truth. Now, I want to start with this question because this is more like a Sunday school more than a sermon. There's the question there. God gives us multiple opportunities to be instruments of His grace. Can you think of one of those opportunities? I want you to think of any situation, any time in your life, now, today, this week, last year, 10 years ago, where God has given you an opportunity to be an instrument of His grace. And it would be nice if you can share with us so we can be benefited by it, all of us. So, think about that. Can you think of one of those opportunities that you would like to share?
Well, if you have to get an illness or go through something like heart problem or cancer or whatever, God is so good and He gives you the opportunity to help somebody else who is in need of help
Somebody else?
spiritually and
Thank you. What would be something tangible that you think you did that God gave you the opportunity to use you as an instrument, to show His kindness? Think about Naomi. She's bitter. Still. We haven't really yet found the resolution to the story. We just saw chapter 1 today. Although I brought in things for chapter 4 to connect and have a close for the sermon, but really we're still in chapter 2. Naomi is bitter. I went full, she said, and the Lord has brought me empty-handed. And I have nothing. Now she's arrived, and this is the time of, it's the beginning of the harvest of barley. And God is going to do some amazing things. And that's what we're going to see right now. Okay? Let's read. We're going to read chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. It says, Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. This is the first time that we read about Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, Go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, and I like how the NIV translates that, we're going to see why. As it turns out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, there are a lot of things there which are amazing. It tells us how God provides to His children. And the first thing, the thing that we will learn from these 3 verses is that God provides miraculously in the not so miraculously ways. What do I mean by that? Sometimes you hear people saying, I want to see great things of God. I want to see that God does great things. We want to see fantastic things like a burning bush or like the parting of the sea. And when we see that, we think God is at work. We forget that the most miraculous things that God does don't have the appearance of things that are great and fantastic. Some of the most miraculous things that God does are disguised in like simple things, in like coincidence, or things that you didn't think, is this really God? But remember, God is sovereign. He's sovereign, and we see a lot of that. And the first point, as you see there, is providence is disguised by chance. Pay attention to those words. The first thing is, now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, that's very, very important. As you see, a worthy man enters the scene. Why it's important that the writer of this book tells us that Naomi had a relative of Elimelech. Why it's important? Well, you need to understand the law of the Old Testament. When a family relative dies in your family, and you see that in Matthew chapter 19, let's go there. How about we go to Matthew 19? Now, Matthew 19 doesn't have anything to do with what we're saying here, but it shows an understanding of the law. Here are the Sadducees talking to Jesus. And this is what they say in Matthew 19. And I better hurry up. Okay, it says, Matthew 19. Is this the passage I'm looking for? No, I'm wrong. This is not the passage. I'm sorry. Forget about it. It doesn't matter. What I was going to say is that the law of Moses required that when a relative died, somebody, a close kinsman, had to redeem the family. And this was practiced in so many different ways. Let's say if a man, the firstborn, had a wife, and he died, but he didn't have any children, his younger brother had to marry his wife. So he can have children, not for himself, but for his older brother who's died. This was a very important law in Israel. And it was important and it was valuable to maintain the means. It was an economical law. That was the way they were able to maintain the whole system, economical system, the order. You guys pay taxes. They didn't have a lot of that. So there were other means in society that they did to do that. To provide, first of all, a lineage. It was important. Genealogies in Israel was very important. So you had to have somebody who bear your name. If a man died without any children, there's something wrong there. He had to have somebody to carry his name. And that was tied to property, to different things like that. So my younger brother, if I die, would marry my wife and would have children, and they would be considered my older brother's children. And they would carry the name. And the next children would be mine. They did that in a lot of different things. Now remember, Naomi doesn't have a husband. And the two girls don't have a husband. The sons died. So apparently, Naomi is completely destitute, to the point that she doesn't even have a name. And you begin chapter 2, and the author tells us, the writer, now Naomi had a relative of her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, do you realize what's happening here? God doesn't tell us what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen, right? But remember, you're reading this book for the first time. You don't know anything. There is a man that it's related to Elimelech. Maybe God is starting to provide. What's going to happen? So we don't know, and it looks like all of a sudden there's this relative. Where's he coming from? Who even knows? It looks like by chance all of a sudden they get to Jerusalem. How big is that? We don't know. And then there's this man. His name is Boaz. And he's a worthy man, a man of standing. Then you go chapter 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. So then Ruth tells her mother-in-law, you know what? We don't have any food. And I need to go out and pick up something. Now, she could do that because, and we will read that a little later when we go to Israel, there were many laws to protect the poor in Israel. Like one of those things is that the farmers were not allowed to harvest from the edges of their field, from the boundaries. They would do everything in the middle, and they would leave those things on the edges of the field and the boundaries for the poor. They would come and pick things up. So somehow Ruth knows that. I mean, I'm just going to go and just get some food so we don't die out of starvation. Let me go, and I'll just go anywhere in whose eyes I will find favor. She doesn't know anything about Boaz. Ruth doesn't. Naomi doesn't know. We know because the writer just told us. And then in verse 3 it says, Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, coincidentally, it's another way to translate that, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. So there is this woman. All of a sudden, Naomi doesn't have anything, and she comes to Jerusalem, and boom, appears a guy that it's related to her somehow. And all of a sudden, Ruth says, "We don't have food. I need to go get something. And I'm just going to go to any fields." And Ruth is walking, on the fields, and and all of a sudden, I'm going to just choose that. And she goes and starts picking. And all of a sudden, that field belongs to Boaz. To a man she didn't know. She hasn't met him yet. And all of these things seem to be happening by accident. Do you realize what's happening there? God is mastering a plan and the circumstances. He's arranging the circumstances to provide amazingly to this woman. But he's not doing those things with amazing, miraculous signs. It's just the way life is going. I'm looking for food, and all of a sudden, she just finds a field and belongs to Elimelech, and so on and so on. But the story continues. Yeah, providence is disguised by chance, but now we realize that God's providence or God's provision, it's carried out or is manifested through his children's kindness. And that's the bulk of the text, verse 14 to 17. And this is the heart of this passage. In chapter 1, we've learned that real provision, it's only found when you choose the great provider. We know that. But chapter 2 is going to show us how the great provider provides for his children. And he does it through the means of his other children. You realize that? God can just make food appear, but he's chosen to do it through the means of other people. He wants to give you the opportunity to be an agent of his great provision. And that's what we see. We see the example of Boaz. The first thing in 4:6, we see that Boaz shows kindness by his words. And not just provision of physical things, but kindness through your words, through your deeds, and through the things that you do. Verse 4 and 6, we read in chapter 2, just then Boaz arrived. Just then, all of a sudden, all of a sudden Ruth chooses a field that belongs to Boaz by coincidence. And by coincidence, the master, who almost doesn't go to the field because really that's for the slaves to do. He has other more important business to do. All of a sudden he decides that he's going to go this day when Ruth was there exactly at the same time. And he says, just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. And he says, "The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you," they answer. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, Who does that young woman belong to? All of a sudden, from all of the women that are there, he notices Ruth. The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." Now, do we find anything there? First of all, we're going to learn a little bit about Boaz's character. He was a man who was very generous. And if you read the story, you think that he does things just to get the girl's heart, right? I mean, he's an old man. Yeah, he has money, but he's old, right? Which young girl is going to pay attention to him, you would think, right? Most people marry young. I mean, he's old. He hasn't gotten married yet. So he's going to do nice things to earn the girl's heart. That's what people would think. But you know what? Boaz wasn't that way. Boaz was kind, even with his slaves. He didn't do things to impress Ruth. He was a man that feared God. And God wants to use us as instruments. He wants to give us the opportunity to be his instruments, to be a blessing to other people. But if we are not transformed individuals, all we are is hypocritical people who do things maybe to get an applause or maybe to get recognition, but not because we care for the glory of God and because we truly care for the person. So before God uses us, we need to realize how is our heart. And that's what the writer of Ruth is going to show us. He's going to show us that Boaz is a very kind man. He expressed his kindness to his servants with a blessing. As soon as he arrives, he's the boss, he's the master. He doesn't give orders. He doesn't say, what he says is, the Lord be with you. That's what he tells his people, his workers. May the Lord bless you. He is the owner of the company. All of these people are under him. And he doesn't come as a dictator giving orders. Why didn't you do this? I thought I've told you that I needed this row harvested. That's not the first thing he does. The first thing he does when he arrives is he greets his servants with a blessing. The Lord be with you. And when you are kind to people with your words, when you show them that you are not just taking advantage of them, but that you actually care for them, people tend to respond in the same way. So what do? They say the same thing. The Lord bless you, they answer. So he expressed his kindness with a blessing. But not only that, he expressed his kindness about Ruth with a concern. That's kind of interesting. In verse 6 he says, then Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? Who is that young woman who is over there? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. Now you would think he notices Ruth. Who would notice a young girl? Now you would think, well, maybe she was very pretty, and I'm sure she was. And maybe that's why she noticed. You could say that. But knowing Boaz's heart, you actually know, and as you read the rest of the book, that he wonders about her because he's concerned. Here's the thing, and you're going to see things that happen later. And I guess I'm going to leave it just there because we're going to get to those verses. But he is not asking for Ruth because he thinks she's hot, which she is. Okay? All right? Kelly, maybe when I look at Kelly, she thought that I would really care so much for her. I'm not that righteous as Boaz. I thought she was hot. And then I did care for her a little bit. But he's not just asking things because of that. He's asking things because he really cares for her. And we will see that a little later. Let's just bear with me. And I guess that's in verses 7 and 9. He shows kindness by his words. That's the kind of man he was. And that's the kind of man that God wants to use to provide. There is provision, right? Real provision is found in the great provider, when you choose the great provider. But he wants to provide through the means and through the aid of his children. Yet, However, we need to be the adequate instrument. And this is how Boaz is. He showed kindness by his deeds. Verses 7 and 9, we read, and he says, she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained there for morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. And now, this is the overseer who's speaking, okay? Then, verse 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. That first word shows you that he's not thinking in romantic terms here. He realized he's an old man, and this is a young girl. And he's very respectful, according to the standards of that culture. He refers to her with kindness, but respectfully, my daughter, he says. My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. There's a lot of stuff going on there. What's happening here? He is providing, first of all, protection for Ruth. Do you realize how the overseer referred to her as the Moabite women? There's stigma there. She's a Moabite. She's a pagan. To modernize the term today, you would call them the person like saying he's the transsexual or she's the prostitute. There's a stigma. She's a Moabite. She's an idolater. She's a woman who, from that land. Now, maybe he wasn't being disrespectful, but that's just who she was. And there could be anger. Her life could be in danger. We don't know. But the author gives us hints because he says, please, 8. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch out the field where the men are harvesting. Don't go where the men are. Don't go to those fields where the men are. Stay here with the women. Work with her. Work with them. Don't go over there where the men are. This guy is a gentleman. And he cares for this girl. And he tells her not to go because they might harm him. He's protecting him. Stay with the women. And if you are thirsty, don't bother. And I guess that's the next point. Not only he shows his kindness in deeds when he provides protection, but when he provides sustenance. If you're thirsty, don't bother go get to the well. There's already jars of water where the man realize it's not his female servants that are filling out the jars. The job of going to the well and get water, apparently, and I say this because we don't know, but these are clues that the writer gives us, wasn't done by the women in his farm or in his land. He says that the men had already got the water out and they had it set in one place. Go there and get your drink. Don't bother trying to do any of that. This is the kind of man we're talking about. He's a kind man. He shows his kindness by his words, and he shows his kindness by his deeds. Not just to Ruth. That's what you think. But he's kind to everyone. To the ladies who work there. He didn't send them with the men, This is the kind of man we're talking about. So God is manifesting His kindness through His children's kindness. That's how God provides to us. Are you that kind of person? But the amazing thing is that not only Boaz is that kind of man, Ruth is that kind of girl. You know, when I talk to youngs, they always, sometimes when they say, I'm looking for the right girl. And it was once said to me, be the right guy if you want the right girl. And that's true. There's a lot of truth of that. Many times we worry about changing the other person. If he would be this way, if she would be that way, if all of that, it would be much better. Probably would be much better. But it would be even much better if I would be the right person. You realize we don't have control over other people. We don't have control how they act, what they do, what they say, how they behave. We don't have control of that. We have control of our lives. Boaz had chosen to be kind with his words to his workers, with his actions protecting the women and Ruth, providing for them. Now, is Ruth the same way? So far, we've seen she's extremely amazing, faithful to her mother-in-law. But we don't know much farther than that, because some women could be very faithful to their mother-in-law, because there is a special bond that exists, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are kind people with the rest, right? So we're going to find out that actually Ruth is an amazing woman. She was the right girl. She was also kind. Verse 10 to 13, we realize about Ruth's kindness toward Naomi, and that is recognized. It was so obvious that it is recognized. Verse 10 to 13 in chapter 2, we read, and it says, at this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner? You realize there? You know why she says a foreigner? Because that's the stigma in Bethlehem, in Jerusalem. She was not appreciated. It's a very racist culture. It was. Jews were very racist. They misunderstood what God told them when God told them to separate from the nations, from their idolatry and sin. And they didn't just separate it from that. In fact, when they wanted to sin, they went to the nations. They became a racist culture, thinking that they were the best and the rest of the nations were trash. And so she's humble. She realizes this man, this rich man, he cares for me. She bowed down and asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. This is amazing. We find Ruth's kindness by her humility. She bows down to Boaz. She is a humble woman. And she's not bragging, with a puffed up chest or with a big head when Boaz tells her all these beautiful things. It's amazing what you've done, for your mother-in-law. No, she is bowing down in a sign of respect. We see her kindness as her love towards Naomi is described. Her love was unquestionable. She left her land, her family, and he came to a different land to be with Naomi. You left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord bless you. Her faith was immovable. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That's amazing because up to this point, you would think with chapter 1 that she came to Jerusalem just because she loved her mother-in-law. You could say, a person who hasn't read the story could say, when she says, your God will be my God and your people will be my people, she doesn't really mean that she loves God. She loves her mother-in-law, so she's willing to do everything it needs to be done for that. Well, Boaz is telling us, actually, it's quite the opposite. She loves her mother-in-law, but she loves God. She chose to come under God's wings. And that's a beautiful picture. He's using a picture that they understand very clearly. Jesus would use the same picture of the hen that has its little cheeks underneath her wings, protecting them, providing for them, keeping safe from the cold and all of those things. It's the same picture he's using. You've chosen the great provider and you have come under his protection. You've chosen him. Yes, she loved Naomi. There's no question about that. But there's no question about her faithfulness. And there's no question about her faith in the great provider, in the true God. So God is gracious and he shows his grace to other people. And then we see something amazing, verse 14 to 17. Boaz is indulgent in his generosity. Indulgent means that he is excessive. He doesn't measure anything. And just read for me, verse 14 to 17. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted. Pay attention to those superlative words. All. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pulled out some stalks from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. You know how many pounds it's an ephah? Do you have any idea? That's about 30 pounds. Okay? That's about 30 pounds. So, what's happening? Boaz is impressed by the kindness of this woman. He's kind himself, and he knows all she's done. And he tells her, stop, come eat with us. And he gives her the roasted grain. It's not just grain. He actually prepares the thing. And it says that she ate until she was full. Like me yesterday. I told Kelly, let's eat a salad, I'm careful, trying to be careful. And Ryan wanted me to try real buffalo wings that can only be gotten in Buffalo, he said. Okay. So I thought that was supper. Because, he bought 50 wings, I think. And that was supper. No, that's not supper. That's snack, he said. And I'm still sick. I still not feel right of how much I ate. Anyways, but, she ate until she couldn't breathe. If we want to paraphrase the text. She was full. But now what happens? Now she's going to go back to the field. She needs to exercise and burn the calories. Otherwise, it wouldn't work out. So she's there, and she's going to pick up things. And Boaz tells the men, he tells them, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. So basically he's saying, come on, don't give her so much work. Why would she go to the field to get all of that? There's already grain on the sheaves and things like that. Just let her get that. Let her get that. He's easing her work, and then he said, in fact, Boaz says, you guys just pick up, every 3 grains throw 2 down the floor, right? 1 in your back, 2, 3 on the floor, 4 on the floor, 1 in your back, and you continue and just throw things on the floor so when she comes behind you, she picks them up. That's what he's doing. He's being indulgent. He's going way above and beyond. And our time is getting close. And what does he do? At the end of the day, this woman has 30 pounds of grain. Now think about it. I struggle with 30 pounds sometimes. This is a young girl, carrying 30 pounds to go home. And as I said before, there is a box there that says, God, through Moses, ordained the farmers of Israel that during the season of harvest, they were not to reap along the edges of their field. This was to be left for the poor. Boaz, because of his kindness, went way above the law. He did not let Ruth reap grain from the edges of the field, but he let her work alongside the other female servants and instructed the male servants to drop to the ground ears of grain. On top of that, he also fed her the best food he had. And this is important. Boaz is a picture of Christ, who not only provides what we do not deserve, but he does it abundantly. He gives us way beyond what we deserve and what we need. It's amazing. Now, God's provision goes beyond the material things. We tend to measure God's provision with money, with things like that. As if, if you have this, you're blessed by God. No, it's not that way. It goes beyond that. And we see that in verses 18 through 23, where we read, she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. So she had so much, and what did she do? What every unselfish and loving person would do. She got her purse and put all the leftover. I need to bring it from my mother-in-law. It's very interesting. There's a practice in Peru. It's very interesting. It's a little awkward, okay? Just so you know, though, when you invite people, you invite them over to your house, or there's a party. Most people go, they go with their bags. I'll go tomorrow to your house and I'll do it the Peruvian way. I'll go to so they're eating, and while they're eating, if there's something left over, a potato, meat, they get their bag and they put the whole thing, and they go, thank you. And many missionaries struggle with this. They think, this is rude. How can they do that? I'm being kind, inviting them to their house. It's not rude, it's just their culture. In fact, when you go to their house, you can do the same thing. Get your bag and put everything and go back home, right? Yeah, Ruth wasn't American, you realize. But she was thinking of her mother-in-law, and she picks everything up and she takes for her. And we continue reading the text. So she carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law, and saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you climb today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." She's seeing this girl, she didn't have anything, and now she's coming home and she's like this. Who is this guy? She's so excited that in the next chapter she's going to plan. And she's going to strategize. How can she get this young girl to marry this old man? She's so excited. She's not dumb. Now, okay, we're going to make this work now. Let's take advantage. Not necessarily, but that's what happened. She's excited. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I work with today is Boaz, she said. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. She has not stopped. And listen to the words of Naomi. And remember, Naomi is the main character. Look what she says. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. Isn't that amazing? What does she say? The last chapter. Don't call me Naomi, call me Mary, because the Lord has turned my life bitter. I went full, and I have come back empty-handed. Now she knew that her mouth was being a little too big. She was hurt. She wasn't thinking. You know, she has a mix of emotions. That's what I'm saying. It's not fair just to read the first chapter. You need to read the whole book. You need to come back if you want to know what else happens. Because it doesn't end here. It's getting great. But it gets even much better. And she says, the Lord has not stopped. That's very important. Because she recognizes that even while she was in Moab, even in the midst of the trials and the suffering, the Lord was kind to her. Even to the point that she thought she was dead. And she remembers her husband in all of that. And she says, he has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. And look what she adds later. He is one of our guardian redeemers. Do you realize the theological implication of that statement? Naomi remembers what the law of Moses says. She thought she was completely destitute, and she realizes, I am not. There is someone here who can care for us and provide. I was wrong when I told my daughters-in-law I don't have a son, and even if I would be able to get pregnant, there's nothing I can do. The Lord never stopped caring for them. He is our guardian redeemer. And again, this term is a legal term for one who has the obligation to redeem a relative in a serious difficulty of any source, of any kind. He had a legal obligation if he was a close relative, unless there is a closer relative. And that will be the case in this story. But however, that's for Wednesday. So if you want to know what happens, come back Wednesday. Then Ruth, verse 21, the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Apparently Ruth now is coming to realize, man, this guy is good. He even told me this. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the woman who worked for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. You realize this. He wasn't just pure talk. He really cared for her protection. Now the text is becoming clear. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. So we see provision from want to abundance. There was no food. Now there is more than 30 pounds. Not just once. She's throughout the whole season of harvest and wheat, working every day, bringing so much food to the house and all of that. And she went from sorrow to joy. In this case, Naomi, she thought she had nothing. She thought she was dead, but the Lord had never stopped caring for us. And there's a kinsman redeemer. Can you sense the joy, the excitement that is taking place? And then they go from danger to security. A Moabite foreigner who could be hated and harmed is being protected by the top dog of town. No one will mess up with Boaz. He's the guy. You know, as you would say in Spanish, he's the rooster of the chicken. He's the rooster in the pen. God's provision is amazing. And the story's not over. There's much more to come. God's indulgent generosity does not end here. If it were to end here, it would be pretty amazing. But it's much more amazing. And we will find out actually a conflict in chapter 3. Like any good Mexican soap opera, when everything is going great, everything is amazing, somebody has to come to mess it up. And that's going to happen on Wednesday. We're going to finish there. But before I finish, it's great to have to understand the text, what's going on. But what good is it if we don't think how that relates to us? What's the importance of that passage for us? What do we care about these amazing stories? Is it there just so we can know a good story? No. God is the great provider, and He wants to provide for His children. But He wants to use His instruments. He wants to use you as a means of His kindness. But you need to portray and show the same kindness in words and in deeds. The way you talk to people, the way you talk to those who are close to you, the way to act towards them, the way you relate to your neighbors. Giving food, it's really very uncaring if it doesn't come with love and with kindness. God wants to do amazing things, but He's chosen to do those things through the instrumentality of His children. First of all, you need to identify if you've chosen the great provider. And if you have done so, you need to be willing and you need to be praying that God will choose to use you as a means of His provision to other people. Be challenged. Don't leave it there. Make it practical. There are certain things that you could do. You can think of someone who has financial needs. You can think of someone who is suffering through an illness. You can think of a boy, of a woman who is struggling in their marriage. You can go be there an aid of encouragement and of wisdom. You can sacrifice your time. You can choose to be like Boaz